Hegel and the modern failure to understand the ancients and Christianity. Let us begin with Hegel. Hegel speaks about everyone and everything, just about. And he looks at the ancients and he says, we've come a long way. The ancients had universals, he says, names, empty names. Here we start tasting Hegel's nominalism. But Hegel is not a medieval nominalist. He builds on empty names. He sees the universal as an opportunity for a development. Look, he says, the ancients had names. They had talk about reality, but it was only talk. They didn't really know what they were talking about. They did not have the content of those names they were uttering. Why not? The time was not ripe yet. The time for the disclosure, the coming of age of the content of the names was not yet at their disposal. We needed to go through an historical development, struggle, war. All of this would lead to the emerging, the development of the name. We could say that the name was there as a contradictory element with respect to material. Material and the name being, we could say, a Cartesian symbolic abstraction, was in tension with the material forces of the universe. And so we have form and we have content, and the two would need to be at war with each other, struggle, and eventually the struggle would bring about a final reconciliation, a reconciliation of form and content. So the ancients had, the ancient philosophers especially, had the forms, but these forms were empty. And then we had the regular people. The regular people represented most authoritatively by, well, religious authorities. At any rate, the regular people, the folk, even the slaves, they provided the material, the passions. These were not yet truth, of course. They were not yet ultimately real. So we have the struggle between masters and slaves, the struggle between form and content. Form, as with Descartes, following Machiavelli's nominalist, neo-nominalist lesson, form empty of content, content empty in itself of form. The two need each other, the two are tied to each other, but in struggle, in tension, they oppose each other. So now, after a long struggle of thousands of years, now finally we see the possibility of a reconciliation in a wonderful society, a universal, open, or global society, where institutions incarnate that synthesis, our institutions. Right. But that was not antiquity. That was Hegel's dream. A dream that was set up to justify modern rationalism, modern reason, a modern way of life, and its new orders and ways, so its new orders being the institutions, and the ways being the way we respond to the institutions, the way we adapt and the way we live, really. What about Hegel? Was he right? Well, we just said that that was his dream. It turns out that the modern assent to a synthesis of form and content finds its most notable incarnation in technocracy, formally manifest in the Nazi movement of Germany's 1930s. What about the ancients? Well, Hegel used an old traditional Christian discourse, manipulated it, misused it, therefore. But for him, all manipulation is, just as for Machiavelli, perfectly legitimate. To understand, ultimately, is to use. You use, and then through your use of sources, you come to an understanding. Well, what about Christianity? Christianity had suggested that the ancients were on the way toward Christianity. That the ancients had not yet faced, especially the ancient philosophers, Christian revelation, the Gospels, the Incarnation. Indeed, the whole discourse of the Gospels is not to be found, is nowhere to be found among so-called pagans, that is to say, the people tied to a place. So we have a certain reading with Hegel, following medieval nominalists, and developing, building on medieval nominalism, a reading of Christianity, on account of which Christianity fulfills the ancients in what we call, and what Hegel would call, historical terms or secular terms. So we have a secular reading of the Gospels, of the Christian message, of the gospel, the good news. We're raised today to take that for granted. And even those who say, well, we are Christians, they, in parallel to whatever they might believe, whatever words they might cherish, they accept, they admit that there was an historical Jesus, there was an historical this, an historical development, that words mean whatever they mean in context, in historical context. They contextualize, they follow Hegel, and consequently they follow Machiavelli. Now, this is all obscuring the nature of the message, right, of antiquity. It is obscuring the ancients. It is also obscuring the Gospels, the meaning of Christianity. Let us consider briefly what the ancient response to Hegel would be, and then let us consider the alternative reading of Christianity that is available to us independently of Hegel and of his influence. Let us consider then first the ancients. By ancients here we mean primarily the philosophers, primarily the Platonic tradition. Why? Because it stands to represent the common sense of ancient people. It stands to represent what is noble, what has dignity in the human being as such, the anthropos. One finds this in the Gospels as well, most notably in the story of the so-called Good Samaritan. But now, what about the ancients' response to Hegel? The ancients' response is that the ancients did not merely have empty words. Those words were mirrors of a reality that was hidden and that by its very nature is hidden. And this, Hegel's discourse, obscures almost entirely, if not entirely. It is the case that truth is hidden for the ancients, but it is not the case that it is begging to be manifest in secular terms. With Christianity, we have the announcement of truth as something hidden. It is a manifest proclamation, right? A manifestation of the hiddenness of truth. And by hiddenness, we also mean the sacredness, for sacred indeed is tied to secret. So, with Christianity, you have the outward proclamation of the truth about truth. We could say that everybody is supposed to see that truth is invisible. The content of faith is, well, things unseen. Seen by God? Yes, but how does God see things? And God, it turns out, sees things in the dark. What does this mean? He sees things not merely as things that are outward, but he sees the interiority of things. He sees the hiddenness of things. In other words, he sees things reflectively, in the element of reflection. God is a mind, for Aristotle, Plato, and the whole tradition that is tied to them, a mind that acts in a reflective mode. So it is not a mind that seeks to empty itself out in its contents, so become a receptacle, but it is a mind that is complete already in its reflective act, in its being not something, right, but the act by which things are manifest. So there is no need for a fulfillment of God as we find in Hegel, an historical fulfillment of God. God fulfills himself, God needs man, God needs war. This is a Machiavellian, and then later, of course, modern in general, and of course, Hegelian lesson. Right? No, God does not need war. The fact that there's war is simply accidental to God's presence, the light being present in the dark. For the light and the dark exposes certain evils. It makes them manifest as it brings itself back within itself. So, the ancients stand for the absolute primacy of the hidden over the manifest, not waiting for someone to manifest what is hidden ultimately. For indeed, Hegel sees Christianity as middle ground, right? As taking a good step in a good direction, which points to Hegel and his revelation. Christianity had shown the importance of the incarnation, and okay, that's manifestation of the hidden. And now Hegel is simply saying, well, look, Christianity is still tied to the old ways of the otherworldly, but we need to fulfill Christianity philosophically or in rational terms with the realization of Christianity. Right? We need to realize what it teaches. We need to put Christianity, the Gospels, in action. And this is very much the discourse of modern Christianity as well. It becomes the discourse of modern Christianity, For indeed, Christianity is used by modern ideologues to advance a modernist cause. That is pretty much what we have, therefore. We have the ancients that stand for the primacy of the hidden. We have the real or early Christians that go on throughout the Middle Ages against the grain of, at the time they were called heretics, heretical movements, and deviances from the Platonic tradition. So we have ancient sophistry that has developed, as it were, and converted or metamorphosized into a very sophisticated discourse, nominalism, voluntarism, the primacy, those who stand for the primacy of the will over the reflective mode of mind, are voluntarists. And so we have the real Christianity that proclaims the truth that had been more vaguely intimated by classical philosophers. It gives authority to that insight. And how? Well, by seeing the Bible and seeing that, look, the best authority that is out there confirms the best philosophy that is out there. Right? In other words, the greatest authority is a mirror of the mind. It belongs to the mind, so that ultimately all authority belongs to the mind. So if we look at the authority of the biblical God, that authority confirms that all lesser modes of authority, not only the consummate authority, but all lesser, right? All degrees of authority are reflections of the essential activity of mind. By that, we are to understand that there is the unlimited and the limited. The limited is the finite, the physically determined, and there is the undetermined. What is undetermined is not just nonsense, but it is the activity that is the source of everything that is limited. What is limited is what is, therefore, you could even say tangible to some extent, but even conceptually graspable. What you can grasp is derived from the unlimited. This unlimited is ultimately an activity. This activity has the character of reflexivity. It turns back upon itself, as it were. So it is not retraceable to something other than itself. And this, the ancient philosophers have taught us, have, of course, discovered. This, the early Christians reiterate authoritatively for everyone. So Christianity is not just Platonism for the idiots, for the many, but it is for all. In other words, it is Platonism that faces the Bible and that now becomes authoritative in the respect that it's for everyone and not just for the few. So it's great. But philosophy, of course, is not overcome by its authoritative guise, as it were. It is not the case that Christianity resolves in a secular way the problems that ancient philosophy had faced. Christianity merely exposes the reality that ancient philosophers were living out. So it is inviting us really to live the philosophical life. as lived and understood by ancient Platonists, so the best of ancient philosophers. That is a wonderful prospect, but of course, the good path is very narrow, right? As Christianity, the Gospels announce, and so most of us will not tread it for one reason or another. With modernity, of course, we have the attempt to have a synthesis of everything, and everything is together and mixed, and we have, of course, a universal pluralism, the rise of pluralism to theological heights, as it were. But this, of course, obscures the nature of being, of reality, of God, of the mind, and we end up with trash talk about thought coming from the brain and truth being relative and justice being an expression of our times. And ultimately, we have the reduction of philosophy to ideology and, of course, the rise of machines that are really involved in chaos management. So God, in his original function, is replaced by a machine that has the proper function of managing chaos, of containing and fueling at the same time chaos. This is where we stand today, and it is worthwhile exposing the lies of modernity for the sake of recovering a glimpse, at the very least, of what modernity, the modern discourse, the modern setup, modern authority, tends to obscure for us. When it does so, it cripples us, or it does not help us in the least. In fact, it prevents us very often from seeing our true condition as human beings, recognizing our nature and our destiny.